Several years ago, I came to an important realization that I want to share with you today. I had spent decades learning about biblical worldview. I've read dozens of books, been to conferences, talked to multiple worldview experts, even taught classes on it. But I came to a realization that there was a central question that I did not have an answer for. And that question was, how does a biblical worldview actually develop? So that set me on a journey to discover the answer to that question. But I couldn't do the whole lifespan, like from birth all the way through adulthood, so I focused specifically on what many researchers and experts call the critical years, and that is the years between 18 and 23. I think we can all agree this is a hugely important time in a human being's life, and particularly a Christian's life, in their worldview development. So what I did was I interviewed dozens of students and individuals who had graduated from college in that age span to figure out how their worldview developed. What I found was a confirmation of what James Sire says, and that is that there's three essential dimensions to a biblical worldview. It's the heart orientation, it's the cognitive presuppositions, and it's the behavioral applications of those things. That was clear. But what I discovered through my research was that young adults who have a strong biblical worldview also exhibit not just the three dimensions, but three dispositions. And those are that they take ownership of their worldview development, they are highly engaged in their worldview development, and they are aware of where they're at in that process. So from that information, I developed a full conceptual model for how biblical worldview develops in students from 18 to 23, and I unpack that in one of the chapters in my book. But what I want to talk to you about today is the importance of basing our efforts at helping other people develop a biblical worldview on a model for how biblical worldview develops. Otherwise, we might be just shooting in the dark. We might be just doing things that we think work, but we don't really know. So what I'm going to suggest to you today is just three takeaways. Now, you've been studying all morning about biblical worldview, and I'm sure you've gotten tons of good content. Our problem is we often stop with content and we don't think through the deeper implications of how that content should transform and actually shape a person's worldview. So based on the model that I've developed, I'm just going to share three quick things. Now, I have a lot of things in the book about how biblical worldview develops and how you can cooperate with that process. But here's three quick things that will give you an idea of the things that you can learn in improving your process in helping other people to develop their worldview. So the first thing you need to do is focus on yourself, and great that you're at this conference focusing on your worldview development. But there's some real everyday activities that you can do that go beyond a conference, and here's a super simple one. When you're at home at the dinner table with your family, put away your phones. Now, we all know to do that because they're distracting and they cause us not to have a relationship. But my family and I discovered an important way that phones actually can keep us from practicing the skills necessary, again, based on that model, practicing the skills necessary for worldview development. You see, when a young adult is processing through life, they are experiencing all kinds of new experiences. And as they experience those new things, new ideas, new trainings or teachings, even crisis and challenge times, what individuals with a strong biblical worldview do is they deeply process their experiences. They don't just kind of go through life having experiences, they actually reflect on them and process them. And they do that through many means. They do that primarily, though, through talking with peers about what they're learning and what they're experiencing. So back to the phone thing. What I found out is when we talk at home about a movie or about something in history or a book we were reading, which we often did around the table, what I found is that when we came upon something that we couldn't remember, like for instance, if you're reading the book Live Not by Lies, you might have a discussion about the Russian Revolution, the communist revolution in the early 1900s. But it might be that you don't remember when exactly that was, who was involved, what its outcome was. Well, I found what my family and I did was we'd whip out our phones almost like an old-fashioned Bible sword drill and see who was the first to come up with the information. What we discovered is that that short-circuited two very important processes that we as a family could be experiencing and that actually relate to this model that I've told you about. And it short-circuited two things. One is cognitive persistence. And by that I mean where you really think hard to remember things that you learned maybe back in high school or in college or that you read in a book. So by whipping out our phones, we short circuit that process of really thinking deeply about something and trying to remember a fact or a concept. But the second thing that it did was it short circuited the process of what I call community or communal thinking. So just picture this. If we can't remember a fact or a figure or some concept, a family together thinking through it together out loud, both of those things, cognitive persistence and communal thinking, are the stuff of biblical worldview development. You see, as you go through life and have new experiences, you need to have lots of cognitive persistence that you push through and you come to conclusions, but you need to be doing that with peers and with colleagues, perhaps at work or with your family at home. So one simple thing you can do when you're at home around the dinner table and you're talking about things, put away the phones, not just for distraction, but so that you foster the kind of disciplines that you need as you develop your worldview. So that's first example. Second example is that I find that as educators, as teachers, many times we focus on the content we're going to deliver instead of thinking through how our students are going to process the content. Processing is a key facet of biblical worldview development. That's what I discovered in that model. So here's a rule of thumb. As much effort as you put into preparing what you're going to present, put effort into preparing how your students or those that you're leading are going to process. Get it? Present and process. And that's actually a cycle. Research shows that the more you present, the more you have to give time for processing in order for students to actually learn and absorb what it is that you want them to learn. So think of it as a presentation processing cycle. And as a teacher, as a pastor, as a parent, do not focus solely on presenting content, but focus equally on giving students opportunities to deeply process what you present. Makes sense? And again, that goes back to our model. The third and final thing I wanted to share with you is the area that we tend to neglect most when we think about biblical worldview development. I feel like our default can easily be, what are the truths that people need to know? And that's fantastic. That's a key part of it. But remember, in Sayre's definition of what worldview is, it also includes our heart inclinations, what it is we truly desire. We are definitely desiring beings. And in order to develop a biblical worldview, you have to have your desires shaped. So can we shape the desires of the people that we're working with, our students, our kids, kids in the youth group, our own children? Yes, we can. And I want to tell you a fun story for when one of my sons was in 8th grade. Every year we'd take time to look through classical music, yes, with an 8th grader, to find a piece of music that he could play on his baritone for our state's music festival. And so what we do, and this one time I have it so etched in my memory, we were sitting on the bed looking through YouTube, looking at different classical pieces of music to find one that he could master and then go and play in this festival. And we came upon one called Bach's Minuet in G. We listened to it. It was kind of quiet in the room. We're listening to it on my phone. When we got done with it, my son literally, now picture this, an 8th grader, flung himself back on the bed and said, "Dad, this is so beautiful." Now, how many 8th graders get excited about classical music? Well, here's the key that I found out and kind of put some things together. From when my son and all my kids really have been born, we have celebrated different musical styles. I mean, we listen to it in the car, but we don't just listen to music in the car or in the home or wherever we are. We really engage the music. We think about it. We talk about the parts that we hear being played. If we hear a cool bass part, we might rewind and play it again so we can hear that. We celebrate the good in that music, and that develops in our kids a desire for music. So can you see how those things work together? By a lifetime of presenting good music to my son, he ended up developing a desire or an inclination towards that music. Now, does he choose classical music now as almost a graduate from high school? No, but when Gabriel's Oboe or some other great piece comes on my playlist, even my adult kids today will kind of hush a little bit and listen to that music because they developed an inclination towards good music. And I just want to encourage you that you can shape the desires or help to shape the desires of the people that you're trying to develop a biblical worldview in by exposing them over a long term, engaging deeply with it, and celebrating that exposure and that music. And that's a way to shape students' desires. And remember, that's a key part of biblical worldview development. So these are just 3 quick tips The book is full of tips, and I encourage you to look for more there. But remember, if you're going to really be effective in helping other people nurture a biblical worldview, your efforts really need to be based on a reliable model for how it actually develops.